Welcome everybody, good morning to sunny Dubai Expo 2020. Really happy to be here at the Swedish Pavilion. I would like to thank the Swedish delegation for providing this beautiful venue. It's an important event today. It's about the future of education, and what better place than at Expo 2020, which is basically looking at the projection of the future of humanity. And education is the backdrop for humanity. So today, what we have here is an outcome of 2.5 years of deliberation by a large number of experts from across the world, from across disciplines, on what education should look like for the 21st century. And I'm happy to say that it sort of calls for a radical change, a revolutionary change to education, and it doesn't mince its words in doing that. But as we start, let me first introduce the ambassador, the Commissioner General at the Swedish Committee for Participation at Expo 2020, who I also was pleasantly told this morning that he would be taking up his position as the Swedish ambassador to India in New Delhi in September of this year. So I would, on behalf of the Institute, we will welcome you when you come to Delhi. So Mr. Jan Teslov, may I invite you to the podium to say a few words?
Thank you very much. And good morning and welcome to the forest, the Swedish Pavilion at Expo 2020. The whole Expo here in Dubai is a microcosmos of the world. 192 partners, 170 plus countries are here. And as education is the best tool if you want to conquer the world, there is not a better place than to be in the microcosmos of Expo 2020. I'm been privileged to not only come from the Swedish Foreign Service, but to come from, in this case, the Swedish Forest Service here at Expo 2020. Because the forest symbolizes something very important. It symbolizes coexistence and co-creation. And our motto here is co-creation for innovation. And I think that that goes very well for the important topic of today. The other day I went to a shopping mall here in Dubai to buy these shoes. And I think as all of us, when you go into a shoe shop or to a clothes shop, you don't say that I want shoes. You say that I would like a pair of shoes for this or that purpose. And in my case, size 9.5. And the nice attendant brought me shoes. I tried them. They fit me perfectly, and I'm very happy. I think the same thing goes for education. You don't go in and ask for to be educated, because all our starting points and our goals in life are different. I don't know if you remember a movie. It came out in 1965 called The Sound of Music, about the Von Trapp family dancing in the Alps. Two very prominent actors, singers, Julie Andrews, Christopher Plummer. Julie didn't only sing well, she also spoke well. She said that everybody is a genius, But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, that fish will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. The wisdom in this quote by Julie Andrews is that we all carry something within us, and education is there to bring it out. I'm very honored and happy to be here on stage today together with the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. There is no sustainability in the broad sense, environmental, economic, or societal, if there is not peace. And there is no peace if we don't work for sustainability. Again, in the broad sense. If we stand on one leg and someone pushes us, we will fall. If we stand on two legs, we might still fall if we are pushed. If we stand on three legs, much more difficult. So, to host this event at the very end of the expo, we are just a few shivering days or moments or hours away from the closing of the expo. And I must say I'm a bit emotional because we've gone through almost 176, 77 days, 20 million visitors to Dubai, 1 million visitors to this pavilion. But then to end on a forward-looking theme. And we so often speak about education for life. But if I could add a nuance to that and end on that nuance, we should think about education throughout life. Because education is not about knowledge primarily, it's by learning how to use what we have here. If we use that, I can promise you we will go for sustainability. I will listen and I will learn today, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jan. Mr. Teslov, I think in many ways he's already set the stage for what we're going to have a discussion today with that analogy with the fish and the tree and the whole fact of personalized education, which is so important. And I think it's been said again and again for too long, and it's time for change, and it's time for an action to motivate that change. I would like to introduce to the podium, and I'm wondering, I'm sure many of you will be saying, who's this guy up there talking this morning? And I was in my excitement, I didn't introduce myself. Because I know myself so well, I thought everybody would know me by then. I'm not there yet. My name is Anant Singh. I wear 3 hats today, actually. I am the director of the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. Had the privilege of being the first director, which means I didn't have any baggage when I started, and I was able to do anything I wanted. And I had a governing board that allowed me to do a lot of things that we tried. We failed some, but I think the ISEE is one of the successes that we attempted. When many people, when we were thinking about this in 2019, said, this is not going to work. You're never going to get academics from so many different disciplines in education together to talk about an issue so controversial as education. But I think we have done that. I'm very proud to be part of that initiative. I also was the co-chair of the assessment panel, kind of oversaw because of the experiences with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which Kofi Annan commissioned in 2000, as well as one of the initial person who kind of drove for the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That was my background in terms of looking at the science between society and ecosystems. That was in terms of expertise and where my passion was. And education seems so natural because that's where the next frontier is. I'm not sure what my third cap is. As a moderator, yes, I forgot. I'm moderating this session, yes. Okay, so let me introduce the next gentleman to the podium. His name is P. Emerson. It's an interesting introduction. He's a serial entrepreneur. He'll tell us what that means, I hope. He's a founder of, maybe because he's a founder of so many different things and very, very important initiatives. He's a founder of CREAP, the Kunskapsskolan Education, Demoscorp, and Silver Life. But we know him as one of the advisory board members of the ISEE Assessment. We invited Pei very early on because he was instrumental in many of our early initiatives, especially in EdTech, when we introduced him to Visakhapatnam in India, and he came and interacted with all our students and staff members. So, Pei, please.
Thank you, thank you, Anant. It's been not a challenge, but an extremely interesting work to be part of the advisory board of this important project. You know, I'm not a scientist, not a policymaker, but a practitioner in education. I founded Kunskapsskolan in Sweden 20 years ago. The basic idea was simple. Human beings are equal, but different. You learn in different ways. And we wanted to build education around each individual needs. Now we are running 35 schools in Sweden, 15,000 students, and I've also opened for our CED program in United Kingdom, United States, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, and India. That's in India where I met the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Peace Education and saw the wealth of ideas and development in education in India. So I've been pleased to be part of this work and see how a project directed to get rid of silos in education, to make sure that policies in education learn from each other, gain experience from each other. And when I see the results, this 1,200 pages of research from scientists, it's a gold mine for policymakers in education in the future. And to grasp some of the most important ideas about personalized learning as a human right and potentiality instead of meritocracy. To build an educational system where each one more direct to compete against yourself and improve yourself than competing against others. And that's, as Ambassador Teslev said, such an integrated part in building a sustainable future in the world. We are talking about educating the global generation, using education as a tool to create better global understanding and a united world. I'm very much looking forward to the future of this pioneering work. You can compare it with being done in the environmental field, where you make sure to exchange ideas, learn from each other, and making sure that we use the resource of education in the best possible way. I looked a bit at how much different countries spend on education. It varies a lot. I looked at how countries spend in education and how they do it for different children. Enormous differences. And I can see potential scope for using the resources in a better way if we learn from each other and if we take note of what scientists can tell us how education is evolving, how new technology can be used in a smarter way to improve individuality in education. I'm also very proud to be able to be here in the Swedish Pavilion, which, as Ambassador Teslev said, it's a very important symbol for the future of the world, this forest of sustainability, where education is an integrated part. And with that, I leave to you, Ananta, and we will listen to you and the panel and all the good result of this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for those few words. So let's get on with business here. Let me introduce you to the four individuals who are sitting here patiently. I have with me Nandini Chatterjee Singh, who's a Senior National Program Officer for the Sciences of Learning at the Institute. She's a cognitive neuroscientist. She did a PhD in physics, but then got lost and then found herself thinking about what I think she really found fascinating when she could put people and image their brains. That's what she did. When she joined the institute, within a couple of months, she scanned my brain. She found it a complete black hole, but she still struggled. I think she still has some hope. She's the co-chair of Working Group 1, which was on education and human flourishing. Then I have Professor Zulfikar Abdul Razak, Tan Sri Dato, Emeritus Professor and Director of the International Islamic University in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. He comes from Working Group 2 on education and context, and as a lead author for Chapter 8, providing inputs on curriculum and pedagogy. And he's going to talk a little bit about how context when we talk about the political, there's economics and cultural, and how that really plays such a big role in education. Then we have Grégoire Boss, a professor of development psychology and cognitive neuroscience at the University of Paris. He's the director of the Laboratory for the Psychology of Child Development and Education. He's the co-chair of Working Group 3, which is on the learning experiences for human flourishing. And then last but not least, Jonathan Kay, Head of Policy at Education Endowment Fund. He was working in Working Group 4 on data and evidence, coordinating lead author for Chapter 3, which I found really exciting. And I wish the whole assessment was based on the way that chapter was written, because it puts it very, very explicitly what we know, what we don't know, what were the results, and with what confidence we can say these results are. And I think what they have suggested is how the future assessments as we continue should be kind of produced. We'll have a policymaker, Amara Martinez, join us from South Africa later when we do the Q&A. She was not able to come for the workshop. And our other policy maker, Wanchok Bida from Bhutan, unfortunately was feeling not well. I hope she's better and is not a victim of that little pesky thing that has been running around the world for the last 2 years and is still around. But we wish her all the best. Now, Let me start off by providing a bit of a context. So I'm going to put my cap as the co-chair of the assessment and tell you a little bit about the assessment, how it started, and why we started, and then start with the Q&A. As many of you know, 2015, for the first time, I think 193 countries came together and signed, it's not legally binding, but at least they signed this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's the first time. And it wasn't like a developmental agenda for developing countries. It was an agenda for all countries. And that was one of the really unique things about the SDG was the universality of the SDGs. It wasn't just for the for the poor countries, but it was for all countries. And out of that was SDG 4, which was on education. And for the Institute, in fact, UNESCO recognizes as the champions for SDG 4.7, which is education for peace and sustainable development. Now, we figured that if it's 2015 and it had a timeline of 2030, that at about this time, there's going to be a huge activity within the UN community as well as all the other, the national level on how well are we doing. It's the midterm. It's halfway through 2030. And so we thought that it would be good that we start this process and sort of have those results ready when there is this midterm evaluation. How well are we doing towards 2030? And even if there's a need for a rethink of the way SDG 4 was formulated. But at the same time, we also had UNESCO take an initiative called the Futures of Education. Every 25 years or so, UNESCO produces this seminal report on where education should be. It's always a philosophical, visionary document. The last one was what was called the Delors report. And when one reads it, you can't really fault with what the Delors report is. But it provides a vision. But they also very clearly acknowledge that they do not provide a blueprint. They say the importance of science, they say the importance of evidence, but the report itself is just a visionary report. And the Director General initiated the Futures of Education report in 2019, which UNESCO Headquarters was education sector undertook. And we knew that it would be another visionary report, and I think there was a need for that reinforcement of that humanistic approach to education. But what we thought at the Institute is, what would be good is to do an assessment of the education systems. Very similar along the lines of the IPCC for climate change or for the Millennium Ecosystem for biodiversity. This has not been done for education, surprisingly. For someone who is coming in new to education, but now not so new, 8 years ago, it has never been done for education, surprisingly, and we were wondering why. So we figured we will take on this challenge, and we put together the ISEE assessment. So in 2019, the invitation of the chief scientist of Quebec in Canada, Remy Curon, was very supportive of the whole fact of using science in education and evidence. So we gathered 20 experts from various disciplines, had 3 days of deliberation. There were really close to fist fights, but we kind of figured we won't get into that level, but we were able to moderate them. Very heated discussions, because we had people from very traditional education, we had neuroscientists, we had philosophers, and they all realized that they had one common goal of education, but the way to achieve it was very different. And there was a lot of mistrust even among the disciplines. And many even asked, why are the brain scientists here? What has that got to do with education? And of course we know, well, everything happens here, the 3-pound mess. But we did agree after 3 days that an assessment is required because of the very fact that we were not able to come to consensus that this had to happen. So 2.5 years later, with COVID, which caused a little bit of a disruption, because one of the things that are essential is periodically the scientists come together face to face, have these discussions, and then go back, write their chapters, come back, present it, and sort of, this dialogue is very important. With COVID, we were not able to do it. We tried to do an online, but we totally forgot that you might have an author from California and an author from Australia, and the time differences were impossible. So we tried the first online, and then we decided that this was not going to be a really optimal way of doing things. So we broke the chapters, and then they did their own deliberations over time. But we never had the chance to gather together and say, hey, what you're saying in working group 3 doesn't really make sense, because we had working group 2, we were talking about context, you haven't taken context into account. That never happened the way that we would have liked to have. But we kind of managed it on an online basis. So suboptimal, but we learned a lot of lessons there. But what we had two fundamental questions to drive this assessment. Are education systems serving the right purpose was important. I think we have forgotten to ask that. We've just got so carried away by implementation, we've just not sat back and said, are we addressing the right purpose? And then, are they equipped to address the pressing challenges we face today, which are very different from the challenges we faced 300 years ago? I use 300 years very specifically because our systems can be traced back to the Prussian attempt of mass education with the industrialization. Comes about to 300 years or so. So, how did the 4 working groups come about? We developed a conceptual framework, because for something so huge, you needed to have a framework along how to guide the whole process. Otherwise, it's all over the landscape. And so we started off with working group 1 is to look at the purpose of education, what has been the purpose of education over the last 50 years. We didn't go back 300 years, but just 50 years. And to sort of say, have they been going towards what Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights very, very succinctly said what education was supposed to be, or is it been serving something else? And they come up with a very interesting finding that it has been serving something else. We have kind of forgotten Article 26 over there. Then we sort of said, then it was very important to understand how that has happened and what were the mediating factors. So we call those the contextual factors that have influenced education. Has it been the science? Has it been evidence? Or has it been driven by ideology? Has it been driven by political? Has it been driven by the economics? And so forth. And whether this has been differing across different parts of the world or so. And that at the macro level. And then we found how it has an impact at the school level. How has it impacted curriculum? How has it impacted pedagogy? How it has impacted the nastiest bit of education, which I call always the nastiest bit, is the learner assessments. All those pesky exams that we set up to evaluate how our students have learned. And then comes back to what has been the latest research on the sciences of learning. That's so important, which has been so missed out in terms of we've got so much of new information that has come from the neurosciences and from the imaging that they have done in terms of how we actually learn. And it contradicts a lot of the present pedagogies and then the curriculum that supports it. And then the feedback to human flourishing. So that's how the 4 working groups evolved, and we had, or rather the 3 working groups evolved. Then we found that the 4th one is that even the scientists and the academics and the experts didn't agree on the term evidence and data. We was like, what? That's pretty straightforward. But no, social scientists had a very different perception of data and evidence, and with the neuroscientists, and so we decided to create a 4th working group just to sort of make it clear what we mean by data and evidence, and how should an assessment based on science and evidence should really evolve. I have to sort of say that most of the working group chapters didn't, because this was the first time they were doing that. But I think it serves as a first starting initial condition for future assessments. So with that, as a context, I want to start off with this, with the questions on, and I'll direct my first question to Nandini. And I'm looking for my questions. And I decided I think I'll change that question a little bit. I think I'll change that a little bit. No. They're so used to me changing questions at the last minute. They're quite used to that. Nandini, as a co-chair of Working Group 1, tell us how I see the assessment highlighted as the first key message and how closely related that every learner learns differently and calls for a personalized education as a human right. And then also looking at policy recommendation 5, which is on universal screening, and how does this relate? But I want to find out why human flourishing.
So thank you, Ananta. Very loaded question. And you'll discover all of Ananta's questions are loaded. And there's stealth at the back because he wants to try and bring out a point. But a very fundamental question which the assessment started out with was the purpose of education. And as we navigated Working Group 1 on human flourishing, it became important to try and see what were the benchmarks to look at the purpose of education. And so if you look at the benchmarks of education as being a purpose of literacy and numeracy for economic growth, then you found that yes, some people, some countries, some societies had achieved it. But if you go back and look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 26 actually says the purpose of education is for human well-being and to develop human personalities, which in the course of Working Group 1 we have now come to look at as human potential, then I'm afraid education has not served its purpose. And a second feature where when we looked at the sciences of learning, and especially the neurosciences, has been that each child learns differently, and that's because every child is wired differently. So when a teacher walks into a classroom and thinks there are 30 children sitting in my classroom, it's not 30 copies of one brain, but 30 different brains sitting into the classroom. And therefore, if we are to have children flourish, which we now want to expand from well-being, is to become the best versions of themselves where they can optimally use their strengths to develop their best abilities and capabilities, then we certainly need to think of education not just as a human right, but a personalized education for flourishing as a human right. Okay. That's something we owe our children because we know that each of us comes with these unique abilities, as the ambassador even started the discussion with today. So how does education try and do this is something that becomes critical for us to look at. It's a daunting challenge, but it's nevertheless something that we should aspire towards. And therefore, if we are to work towards that, I think one of the first things we would need to think of is how do we identify what might be strengths in a child when they walk into a classroom. And that's why the notion of universal screening was proposed as a very important part of the assessment, is how can governments and education systems begin to mandate into their education processes ways where we identify strengths and weaknesses in children so that education systems that they are provided, the pedagogies that are provided to them, are structured so that they might be able to achieve human flourishing and become the best versions of themselves. Again, daunting challenges, but with the way we understand how the brain learns, the way pedagogy is beginning to change in the classroom, and possibly the use of technology, there is certainly promise for the future that we might be able to go towards that. I hope that answers some of your questions.
So you told me, well, you sort of identified technologies because I was sort of saying, okay, great, but how do you do this? Okay, you got what? In India itself, there are 300 million kids. That's the whole size of the United States population, and you want to give a personalized education. I'm going to be a devil's advocate. It's going to be difficult to be a devil's advocate of, as well as being the co-chair. So I'm going to find holes in the assessment that I was co-chairing. It's kind of difficult to do it, but I do live in a schizophrenic world on a daily basis, so it should be comfortable. You made a very important point. Benchmarks are key. right? You manage what you measure. So right now we are measuring, as you sort of say, the assessment says our focus is on human capital. Is that numeracy and literacy? Because as an economist, that's how we calculate human capital. And the assessment, if I'm right, you're saying that it has done a relatively great job if we are measuring human capital. But if we flip it and say flourishing, we're
not doing so well.
All right. I was going to say we suck at it, but okay. All right. So we need to pick up our socks up there. Now, I'm going to go to Amara, and I think I saw her on the screen. Oh, there she is. Amara, as a policymaker from South Africa, you also have a sizable population. You got a big challenge with the kids. You're coming. Tell us if this is realistic, and what you take away from this message, and what does that mean for a country as large as South Africa?
Thanks so much, Ananta, and hi to everybody that's listening in. So in terms of South Africa, where I sit, I think there's no sort of yes or no answer to whether we find this to be realistic. So in some settings, perhaps in the global north, this may be feasible, and perhaps some parts of the global south, and in fact may already be happening. In a global south context where I find myself, the opportunity to really provide this type of assessment may be possible as a wide-scale or universal screening tool. But I think what happens thereafter might be a little bit challenging. And I think this is where your point, Ananta, comes in about how realistic is it actually. So practically providing individual assessments in excess of 2 or 3, or as you say, 300 million learners, what will this look like? How costly will it be? And also, this might also require teacher training, curriculum changes, budget changes, and of course, not to mention mindset shifts, which, as we all may know, takes a long time and may not be everybody's cup of tea. So if I were going to do something like this, I'd start small and scale up in phases, which may be a bit more palatable for decision makers, maybe a bit more palatable for those in the Treasury making the budget decisions, as it may be perceived as not having a very high cost at first, because it is small scale, and importantly won't cause too much disruption to an already overburdened system. So I think what COVID has taught us is that we've had to pick up the pieces after a pandemic, thinking through what this means for the education system. There's been lots of disruption, and particularly in a South context. And I think this is important to bear in mind. So whether it is realistic, I would say it is possible, but it is thinking through what those challenges might look like and thinking about how we could actually make something like this land in a political sphere as well as in a policy-making sphere, because that's the most important thing, because it's pointless writing many articles and reports, but then it doesn't land in the places and the spaces that we'd like it to. Thanks, Ananta.
All right. So Amara says teacher training is important, start small, but in many ways it is a challenge for a lot of, in particular, developing countries with limited resources. I think that's the take-home message. I wanted to, maybe go a bit off script. This has been scripted, so I'm going to go a bit off script, but they know that I was going to go a bit off script. Is that technology is going to be a major game leveler, but it could also become what many are now saying is going to be the biggest in terms of widening the inequality. Zulkifli, I'm going to Zul, if I might. I know that I was going to talk, you can, in terms of the context, and you come from Malaysia, you have worked with, if I'm not mistaken, with the higher education primarily, but in education in general. The chapter that you were responsible for in designing curricula, pedagogy, and learner assessment for a personalized education. If you can tell us a little bit about how that will play out and what your chapter recommends. And then maybe after that, I will sort of say, how do we scale this up? to make this as the great equalizer rather than the great equalizer?
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's almost like a dream come true. It's something that we've been talking for a long time, but never had a kind of a platform. I really envy Greta Thunberg, you know. She's the one who's now saying that education is no longer relevant for her generation. But I thought my generation at that time, education wasn't relevant at all. So this is a time that I would want to speak about it. I mean, education has been presented to us as almost a one-size-fits-all. So every country needs to go to this kind of a convention that somebody decides this is education for us, and for us in the global south particularly, we'll just need to subscribe to this, because then the benchmark was put somewhere else. We talk about world-class university, we talk about all the other models that is in the global north, but has no relevance to the global south at all. But we cannot compete, because the moment we compete, then we become irrelevant, and then the government doesn't like it, you know, and all the other measurements internationally, PISA, whatever you have, will not apply to us. And we seem to be almost a university that is non-functional, at least from the global sense. So I think there's a very important question about context. And therefore, the context that we want to see as far as the global south is concerned, my university is concerned, when we start to look at sustainable development as a goal for education. Even the definition of sustainable development talks about the present and not compromising the future. And the question we ask ourselves, what about the past? Isn't the past relevant? You know, and as we go through the past, then we find that sustainable development has been part of the culture for a long time. Bali, the Subak system, has got sustainable development built in more than 1,000 years. Bhutan has got sustainable development. My own culture, the word Sejahtera, we've got it here, yeah, has been about sustainable development. So it's not a story of 30 years ago where Brundtland's report, the World Commission comes in and talk about sustainable development. It has been in our context for a long time. Now, as though we need to relearn this because somebody else now tell us sustainable development is important, why can't we go back to our context and find out what sustainable development within our own culture, our own norms, and our values, and then it's part of education. It becomes an organically grown. It's not something that we then transform it inside. So in our context, in my university that I've been in, now we look at this and we do not negate there is a global sort of continuity that we need to subscribe to, but we go back to our own philosophy of education. And that talks about balance, that talks about harmony, that talks about peace, that talks about, you know, how do you live together as human person first, rather than engineer, doctor, or what have you. How do you build this better human being? And therefore, the cliche that we took for ourselves is about humanizing education. To be the human person first, and then follow up whatever else that you need to do. That has been the construct that we took. And then we also find that this one mesh with the UNESCO 4 pillars of learning. Learning to know, learning to do, which we do very well, but we have not even bridged into learning to be and learning to live together. And suddenly the word learning to be jumps out and looks as though there is something part and parcel of the philosophy that we want to develop. And therefore we marry these two, learning to be and now learning to become, as part and parcel of that. And then the whole structure of sustainable development becomes a construct. And this book explains everything. We've got this now for 2 years. This has been the university sort of blueprint of how we want to move into the future, taking all this together within the context of the nation and I think within the context of ASEAN in this particular respect.
So let me be a devil's advocate here. We live in a closed system, which is the planet Earth. So this whole notion about, and I think COVID has tended to push this a little bit in terms of nationalism, self-sufficiency, looking at within, and you mentioned within our country and within ASEAN. But the interconnectedness is so high because we have 7 billion people on this planet and it's going up to 9 billion. We are way beyond our carrying capacity, as ecologists have said. If we don't have an education system that advocates what in the whole Hindu scripts called, and correct me if I get the pronunciation as usual mixed up, Vasudeva Kutukambakam. The world is one, which was during about what 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So, but so what I hear is that all these countries sort of say we have it in our systems, we have it in our past, but what right now is the dominant system is the consumerist society that has just taken over all our lives. So you got to change, you have a fundamental change in mindset that's required, because the education system, whatever one says, is a one-size-fits-all across the world. Now, so I want to talk to, puts this to Gregoire for you to mull over it as well and rebuttal me later. But Jonathan, I had you, but I want to go to Gregoire first. You know, when you say context, and we have had lots of discussions in the meetings where a lot of the social scientists come back and say context, context, context. But at the end of the day, I want to ask you as a layperson, irrespective of context, are there some general principles of learning that we have to cut across, whatever race that you come from, whatever political ideology you come from, we are, at the end of the day, humans and of a human species. If you go at a biological level, we like to think that we are all different, but if some alien comes and says, you're just one damn species, I'm sorry, pardon my term, my language. But tell me, as a neuroscientist.
Well, what I can tell you from a neuroscientist point of view is that we all have within our head this incredible, basically, thing that is like where we have like 86 billion neurons, which is actually 10 times the size of the population of the Earth. It's as many stars that we have in the galaxy. And it's actually connected by 1 million of billions of connection between those neurons. And this is true for all humans, which is basically also the great unknown. We don't know a lot about the brain. We know a couple of things. We know that it doesn't work with basically one neuron doing one thing. It's like very interconnected, which means that we know now that when we learn, it's not just a cognitive process. It's also a social process, and that's what actually traditional educational psychologist has been saying, or traditional educational scientist has been saying. It's also an emotional process. When you learn, you feel emotions. It could be different type of emotions. When I do an errors, I feel sometimes a bit disappointed, but that's also the key to learn. And we know that this is true for all learners. Whenever I make a mistake, my brain will send signals upward, downward, and that will actually lead me to change my behavior and to adapt by changing the type of strategy I'm using. And this is true for all learners. Having said that, we also know that this brain is very much shaped by the environment, because we are a species which probably differentiate us from any other species, where our brain actually continue to grow for a very, very long time. So our brain is not shaped as an adult brain until 22, 25 years of age, which means that the whole time we spent in our educational system, if it's primary, secondary, or higher education system, we'll still have a brain that is consistently evolving. And this is why we are at the time where we can learn so easily. So we can say, and Nandini said that, we all have a different brain. And this is actually true, because our brain is shaped by our own experience along the way. But then the laws of the learning brain are the same for each and every individuals. And that's very important to understand that. We can be all different, but the way we learn is governed by the same type of laws. Like, let me give you an example. Like this old psychologist called William James said that, well, actually the tides are all different. Like if you go at the sea, the tides will never be the same, but they are governed by the same principles. And this is what we need to understand, is that the principles are the same. Then we need to adapt the way we teach based on this principle. It makes no sense to do pedagogy based on the brain. But like having information on how the brain learn, what are the key principles? So for instance, we know that motivation is super important. If you induce motivation in the learners, that will actually have an effect on the whole brain of this learner. So motivation is one of the key that we have. Like curiosity is an emotion, it's an intellectual emotion, as Theodule Ribaud was saying. And we know also that playing on the curiosity of the learners will work for each and every learners. So we're all different, but governed by the same principle, basically.
Which means the context, so the principles are the same, but the context in terms of the what and the how then defines the final person and the behavioral outcomes that. So in many ways, maybe what we should be really focusing on as we move forward in the future of education is how to map the learning process, which are common principles, and understanding a context which is ideal, if I can use the term, an ideal context that optimizes flourishing, which is the potentiality. So which we come back to key message 2, I think, on potentiality versus meritocracy. So Zul, I come back to you. So how do you break the meritocracy trap, which Markowitz talks about in his book, and which chapter 3 of Working Group 2 really focuses on in terms of how the privatization, commodification, and the learner assessments have gone hand in hand to create this, what we call the new aristocrats of the world, the heritage meritocracy. How do you break that?
It's not going to be easy because we are all hardwired into this. And that's why your report looks fantastic. I mean, the report, I wish I can have it.
I didn't pay him to say that, but
you know. So the question is, I think we've got an acronym for this. The new education presently we call it WEIRD. W is Westernized. Westernized not in terms of location, Westernized because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is the one that tweaks everything out of line.
And this has got no geographical, south, because the whole world is in fact caught up in this.
Yeah. I'm talking about Westernized in the context of Industrial Revolution. It started there. Yeah. And then it becomes economic centric. Yeah. Everything's now is about economy. Education is about economy now. Your neoliberalism, human capital. Then it becomes industrial-led. Industry tells us what to teach. Philosophy is no longer important because the industry thinks philosophy is not important. Yeah. And then we go reputational obsessed. Everybody talks about ranking. I need to be number 1 all the time, and we compete with everybody else. Even without our resources, we want to compete with Harvard because we want to be number 1. And finally, the last one is dehumanizing. And that is one that is taking us at today now. How do you dehumanize people through education? This is something that I think we need to really think about. The education today is not humanizing people, they're dehumanizing people. And we need to change this. Now, when I talk about the indigenous dimension, we have got this in every society. Japan has got Ikigai. Africa has got Ubuntu. Sweden has got Lagom. Chinese have got Yin and Yang. All these are human heritage as far as knowledge is concerned, but we have never connected them because the modern world do not need them. The moment you connect this, then you find that human values are all the same. They talk about balance, they talk about harmony, they talk about, all these things that we human beings must have. Microcosm, all the things that we talk. We need to bring this back as the kind of a wealth of society that grows within the society, is not invented from outside.
So in a way, we got to connect our students across the world, in a sense, in terms of looking at it as a global community, as well as bringing up all the different value systems that are universal, which they are, and then how do you integrate that within curricula, I would even think even in maths, let's say looking at maths and science and how to humanize maths and science. And again, that's the whole brain approach that the assessment talks about. Because we have tried in terms of how to bring social and emotional in maths, because maths creates so much of anxiety, and it's one of the biggest depressors in the present academic system. But
can I just add another one? There's another point that is missing here. You talk about the brain, and I appreciate it. But in our tradition, we talk about the heart. All this tradition, we talk about the heart.
Yeah.
The heart is not even factored in education. The little that I know about neuroscience, now the heart and the brains are working together.
Well, that's interesting. And we can have a separate discussion in terms of, because I know that now there's a whole new of gut neurons where they have identified neurons in the gut. But then when I talked about Nandini, at the end of the day, it still comes from this side. The heart is right. But that's another issue that we will keep away. I want to talk to Jonathan. Jonathan, data. And when you look at all the statements that this assessment is making, the data basically is not along the lines that you would consider as data and evidence. It comes from the literature, and we sort of say, okay, 60% of the literature seems to point towards this, therefore, that's why we come up with these key messages. But tell us a little bit more in terms of how you would think about making a much stronger argument when you go to the policymaker with the kind of data that we need, that you saw missing and that you would like as we move forward.
Sure, and I guess there are two important components. There's data acquisition and the quality of data that we're producing, and there's data use and actually how we put it in the hands of policymakers so it can actually change the outcomes of children. And on data acquisition, what we want is a move from data to evidence. So all systems collect data of some sort, be it PISA data, be it outcome data, be it the informal observations that you just do in a classroom as a teacher, all points of data. The challenge that we have is how we move from data that allows us to say where we are at the moment to evidence that tells us if the approaches that we're taking are actually making a difference. And this can actually help us navigate some of the discussion that we've just had. So how we learn from cognitive science, but how we then apply it in a particular context. So we should, of course, learn and build upon the theories, but as we apply those theories in any particular context, so take the example of motivation, we might attempt an approach, and in a particular context, that might not change the motivation of pupils. And what we need to do is compare that approach to a different approach and see whether it's making a real difference. We actually did a randomized control trial in England where we paid pupils, we provided financial incentives to try and increase their motivation. Didn't make a difference. Didn't increase their motivation, didn't increase their outcomes. But it's only by building that rigorous evidence that we're able to find that out. If we hadn't done it, we might be paying pupils year after year and just throwing money away. And so the important thing that we need to do is move to those rigorous evaluations that can give us those insights, whatever outcomes we care about, to make sure that we're progressing successfully. And we've got a lot to learn from things like medicine, because we'd never dream of giving a medical treatment to anyone without there being a hard evidence base behind it. But we're perfectly willing to intervene in the lives of children all the time without that rigorous evidence base. So the first thing we want to call for is building the quality of our data to move from data to evidence. But that's not enough, because you can have the best evidence in the world, but if it sits in an academic journal, if it sits behind a paywall, if it sits behind academic language, then it's not going to make any kind of difference. And so the second type of collaboration we need is a social contract between researchers and policymakers. And what researchers need to do is make their research accessible, right for audiences that aren't other academics, and research things that policymakers are actually interested in and teachers are actually interested in. But the flip side of that is that policymakers need to invest in finding out what works. So not just doing things, but finding out whether those things are actually making a difference. And one of the things we tried to do in Working Group 4 is begin to map where we are at the moment. So we can learn a lot from the rigorous evaluations that do exist. And we try to communicate it in a way that hopefully is accessible to everyone, not hidden behind that academic language. So we map a number of approaches, things like high quality feedback, things like homework, things like small group tuition, and we describe the evidence for it. And we describe it in 3 key terms: impact, in terms of months' progress, how effective is the approach; cost, because there might be lots of approaches that are effective but are not cost effective; and security. And we describe security in terms of padlocks, in terms of how good the evidence base is, how many studies there are, and how high quality are those studies. And in communicating evidence in that format, it's hopefully accessible to policymakers and also the teachers that make a real difference to people's lives. So the aim has to be to create rigorous evidence and then to put the evidence in the hands of policymakers. And all of that research is available in the report and also online. So in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, we have that accessible summary free to everyone to empower policymakers and to empower teachers.
So let me throw this one to you. Quantum leap. When you look at data, the way it's being collected, it's very old, still very old-fashioned in many sense. But education now, in many parts of the world, even in the global south, has been captured, I would say, by huge edtech companies. And learning is getting onto learning platforms. And that data is being captured by private companies. And it's not going to be accessible. In many cases, they will have conditions and stuff. The role of AI, data, and evidence and impact. Chapter 6 talks a little bit about, I'm just showing off a bit that I know the reports by heart, but actually it's just already scripted. But chapter 6 is on technology, if I'm not mistaken, working group 2. They do talk about AI and its potential, but also it's on the cautionary. But putting aside the cautionary, how do you see AI and what it captures in terms of the learner behavior information that is being captured by all these learning platforms and contributing towards policy making? How would you...
So yeah, there's a number of really exciting possibilities in education technology, not least getting that high quality data about what learners are achieving, about what learners are struggling with, so that you can begin to target approaches more effectively to the individual needs of the learner. We should say that that's been happening for years and years, but it's been happening through the ultimate intelligence, which is teachers knowing their pupils and applying techniques appropriately. But in terms of research, obviously, collecting that data might allow us to build the evidence base quicker. But I would say that there does have to be the cautionary note around digital technology and edtech, because it's very easy to sell edtech. It's very easy to promise the world of edtech and just say the word innovation a lot and just say the word digital technology a lot, but to lose those principles of learning and to lose those principles of rigorous evaluation. So we shouldn't just say, yes, that sounds exciting when we're offered digital technology. We should say, show me how it works, show me that it's actually making a difference to my learners.
Yeah, so the black box, as many of them say, and they say we don't know what's happening, has to be deconstructed. Amira, I'm going to come back to you because I think the global south, and especially countries like South Africa, is where most of these learning platforms are kind of targeting it because it's a huge market. How do you see that playing out in South Africa? And sort of, are you afraid in terms of it? Because I know much of it has not much science behind the learning platforms. It's just basically taking what's going on in schools and putting it online. How do you see that playing out in a country like South Africa?
I think that there is potential, and I support what the previous speaker has said. But there has to be a word of caution about how you use various technologies. So it can be a help, but it can also be a hindrance. I think the earlier comments about the digital divide, and particularly exacerbated with COVID-19, has really just emphasize that some people just don't have access to connectivity. They don't have access to data. And so how will an EdTech product assist someone like that? And so what we've seen in South Africa, we had rotational schedules where 50% of the learners came to school and 50% of them stayed at home. Those coming from poorer communities who stayed at home basically did no work. And so what would a platform, a digital platform actually help those kids to do? Because they in fact don't even have access to a computer, to data. And I think this can be said for most other global South countries who do struggle. So I think that, word of caution is that yes, it can be useful. It can be very useful for certain learners, but there are many others who are further divided as a result of technology. And so it is that careful balance about what you actually provide as a government, as a policymaker to your learners and to the broader community versus what would be most useful for them in the situation or context that they find themselves in.
So many complexities, so many variables. So I want to kind of bring it down to still the focus on potentiality, the individualized or personalized learning, and what is the possibility for scaling up. I've heard again and again from the global South that the technology is going to be the greatest inequalizer, rather than sort of saying that, especially with COVID, that digital education is inevitable. It provides a potential, and there's a massive scaling up of making sure that it's available to everybody, but to make sure that if it is done in the proper way. So if you look at potentiality and individualized learning or personalized learning, there is no other way than through digital technology, because it's just too large a number. We just can't get teachers of that numbers. So how is somebody from South Africa, you're going to go back to your government and say, let's just not buy one extra jet fighter and then buy laptops for every child? It's easily, I think you'll be basically able to buy 2 laptops for every child with one jet fighter plane, isn't it? I think it's about 48 million or 100 million for a fighter jet, and then it gets shot down and it's just gone, it's burnt. So what do you say to that?
I think the one thing, and I also just want to re-emphasize what the previous speaker has said about data and evidence, because with everything in terms of education, one has to provide that evidence base in order to influence policy decisions. So granted, not everybody is on the same page in terms of data and evidence and what constitutes as quality data. But I think when making and taking decisions as policymakers, one needs to look at the fact. And so I think that what we've been doing as a country now is to think about how do we sort of test things to be able to see whether it does work. So that instead of, spending 48 million straight away, can we spend 2 or 3 million just to test and trial things to make sure that it does actually work? And I think that this has been, and I think it comes back to my previous point about testing things, trialing things, experimenting to show that there is a proof of concept before you launch in and make sort of big budget decisions. And I think that is one way of doing this type of work, to be able to really say that this could work, this is the evidence, and so this is the reason why we should perhaps explore this. I think the thing about policymakers and politicians is that if something doesn't work, nobody wants to be told that it doesn't actually work. It should be something that can see gains quite quickly, but also in a way that does prove that it can work. So if anything, the idea about potentiality, the idea about individual assessments is a very, very exciting prospect. And I think as a policymaker and also as an implementer, this is something I think has great potential. But again, it comes back to the how we do it and also the why. And I think that this is something that we can prove through evidence. And one of the things that we are pushing for is looking at evidence-based policymaking rather than, looking at somebody that you just met for lunch that has said this works, but rather proving that things things do actually work. And I think that that's one way of doing it.
So, very wisely said as a policymaker, small, I think you emphasize small experiments, but I think if I'm going to put back, I see lots of hands among the panelists here putting up their hands to respond to that. But you most probably will need to have a 5-year plan so that you stick the 5 years and sort of give the researchers 5 years to say, you're going to try to do this and this is your budget. Come back in 5 years with the evidence either way, whether it worked, if it worked, how well did it work? And if it did not work, I find that my philosophy is the best success are the failures that you encounter. But we would need to put some kind of a plan in place so that otherwise it's always an ad hoc thing, small little projects here and there. And that doesn't speak to, in terms of the generality of the interventions that you have done. Now, I saw Jonathan put his hands up. Nandini puts the second. It's not a why not, because time is very valuable here. So there's a high marginal cost for the value of that. Yes, Jonathan, Nandini, and then if you want to intervene, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on how exciting and how far we're already coming in this journey towards evidence-based education. So the Education Endowment Foundation that I work for was formed in 2011. Back then, there were no randomized control trials in English education, maybe 2 or 3.
Can you tell what RCT is?
Randomized control trial. So the type of trials that are used, the experimental methods that are used in medicine to test whether things are effective or not, where we compare 2 groups assigned randomly between intervention and control, and then compare the outcomes at the end of that. And we've moved from a world in which there were no randomized control trials, or very few, to one where now half of the schools in England have been part of a randomized control trial. We've published over 100, we've funded over 150. And the interesting reflection there is policymakers see it as a cost-effective investment. Yes, it takes a lot of time, but when you spend billions and billions of pounds or dollars on education, if you spend even a tiny fraction on finding out how things and whether things work, then you can spend all of the rest in a much more effective manner. And as much as it might be frustrating when things don't work, and often things don't work, so I think actually only about 1 in 4 of the things that we test has a positive outcome, it's really important that we know about those 3 and 4 things, and it's really important that we stop doing them. Because why should we waste time, waste money, waste resource on doing things that aren't actually making a difference to children? So negative, null results might be frustrating in the moment, might not get you an academic publication, might be annoying as a researcher, but actually they're often the most important messages as a policymaker or as a teacher about what you should stop doing and what doesn't work, not just what does work.
Okay. He just slipped me $1, so I'm going to let him go in first, and then Nandini, and then Zul. I know. Yeah. My flourishing went up very...
It was the amount of dollars I gave him. Yeah. No, just one thing. I was just want to reflect on what Jonathan said and what we heard. There's another issue that we have usually is RCTs done in UK won't necessarily have the same outcome if you do it in the global south. So we also need to push forward this idea that we need to do collaborative research toward global north, global south. When we do RCTs in the global north, we shouldn't say to the global south, this is working, it should work, because basically it's on the same general principle. We know that educational systems have their own specificity. So we need to push forward this idea that we need to do those RCTs in parallel. So if we do it in the UK, we should do it somewhere else. And even within the global north, we know that, for instance, growth mindset. So the idea that if you talk about the brain, you say that the brain will change through learning, and that actually promotes a different idea about how you learn and the fact that you're not stuck to be good or bad at math, but if I invest time and effort, I can actually make some progress. That really worked in the US and didn't work in the UK. So even within the global north, we need to have like those systematic RCTs. And second thing, which is I think key, RCTs are not basically giving you evidence at the level of an educational system. So the second part of the study needs to basically address the big question that we all try to address. How do you scale up? How do you make sure that when it works at the scale of an RCTs, it still works at the level of an educational system? And this is super complex because it depends on how you structure your educational system. So for instance, in France, we're very Jacobinist, centralized school system. So if you want to change something, you need to change it at the scale of the country. So it's super complex. It will cost a lot. So maybe it won't work in France. It might work somewhere else. So we need also to take that into account for the policymakers.
Nandini?
Sure. So actually, now that we've come to the stage where we're beginning to move a discussion on education from being an opinion to a complex transdisciplinary science, I think I want to draw the conversation back to data and assessment, something that you talked about earlier, Ananta.
Learner assessment.
Learner assessments. And so we've spent a lot of time agonizing, comparing PISA assessments across different parts of the world, and completely ignoring the fact that the contexts are completely different. And so those comparisons are really not valid. And therefore, moving now to a situation where we might begin to look at learner-based assessments which look at potentiality and therefore look at longitudinal data acquisition so that we can begin to see growth happening in terms of learning rather than caring about a standardized assessment. Given that we are making this big change, as long as growth in terms of learning begins to happen, the child becomes their own benchmark that will not only, I think, add to better data, and I'm sure Jonathan will provide the specifics of that, but will also enable us to bring in potentiality as a reality in the education system. And so Jonathan would respond.
It's a very interesting, Zul, I'll come to you, but Kevin Collins, who's the co-chair of the advisory board of the assessment, made a very interesting point in the launch in Paris, where if you think about potentiality, and as we go into the future where the famous quote, we have no idea what the jobs are 10 years from now, you really need a learner who is able to learn.
Absolutely.
Who's flexible, who's malleable. And that is more measured by potentiality, because you're seeing the deltas rather than absolutes, versus meritocracy, which he calls it as a one-time stamp. You don't want those anymore because you don't know whether they can learn, whether their adaptability to learn is going to be that high. And so potentiality is the one that is going to be a lot more commensurate with the 21st century, where life is going to be so uncertain that you need people who are able to be adaptable and who can learn, in fact. So that's so.
Talking about data and evidence. One is staring in our face, I think just maybe 2 weeks ago, and McGill gave a kind of a research that shows that the most addictive to technology is China, and then Saudi Arabia, and then Malaysia, and then Brazil, 25 countries. And the bottoms are Germany, Japan, UK, US. You can almost see that the global south are the one the youth are very addictive to, whereas the global north do not have that. And that's not the first study. 5 years ago, was the same thing. A 10-year study within the 10-country study. The developing countries were China and with India and Malaysia. These two countries are the worst compared to the global south. So there's something in technology that we are not doing right. We don't understand it.
Definitely.
So we go into that kind of an understanding, and then whatever you introduce, it will backfire.
Yeah. No, in fact, the assessment talks about, in terms of the technology that was used for COVID, as it was far from what pedagogy is. It was one of the worst interventions. And in fact, I'm hoping that somebody will write to sort of say that we should never have done that as a piecemeal, trying to, rather than focus on the emotional status of our students who have been put in lockdowns when they have never had such an event. It's like a world war, isn't it, in terms of the way they've been confined. But I want to move to one of our guests here, who is the Director of Education of the Kunskapen schools, which have schools in Sweden, India, and so forth. Christian Wettel. Tell us a little bit about the discussions that we have had, differences, Global South, Global North. You have schools in both Global North, Global South. And how do you see, are there major differences in terms of the kind of curricula you use, or the curricula is different, the pedagogy is similar? How do you navigate this minefield?
My view of the global education scene is that children are not that different. All children are different, but not when it comes to different nationalities. So I think borders to me is not really important when it comes to education. So when I work with people in India, in the Netherlands, or in UK, I think we all agree on that. We discuss policy now. So I think we all agree on that. What happens to student education is not on policy level. It is in the classroom. It is with the teachers. So I think when we talk about policies like this, I think we really need to think, do we build frameworks for quality, for example, that really assesses teachers, schools, organizations, or is the main focus that we assess the academic results of students? And I think looking then to the possibility of sharing and learning between communities, I think there is so much potential. So going back to the student, we are here today because I think we want to make a change for all children. And we want to make a change for society. So really give it the opportunity to students to be able to discuss and share and understand society. That's what I think the network for me in Kunskapsskolan, being able to provide that to both students as well as teachers, as well as people as myself, directors, that can actually discuss this and learn. But I think we need then to go back to think, like you talked about purpose of education. And actually, I had the opportunity to interview Andreas Schleicher, the director of OECD for PISA. And when Andreas Schleicher even starts talking now about that we need to see the whole person. So the general of PISA is now talking about we need to change that perspective, because I all think, the stress that PISA has put on us. So I see together with in this great report from the Institute that there is now a possibility to really make a change, not only in discussing policy, but also in the way we organize schools.
Should we just get rid of PISA then? Why are we just, there's always this continuous, so I'm really going to be a devil's advocate here. I remember in the 80s, the World Bank, very different. Was the architect of the structural adjustment programs. Completely destroyed most developing countries. And then 20 years later, after lots of research from the economic professions saying, this doesn't work, because you take a structural adjustment program, you create social disturbances, and then it created countries going into overthrowing governments and stuff. And then 20, 30 years later, they came and acknowledged that structural adjustment programs was a bad idea, and then they started changing things. The report is very critical about these global student learning assessments, because they don't actually assess the learning. And I think I've heard that where countries were not doing well in PISA, then started directing their teachers to train their students for PISA, and then immediately they became good at PISA. So you're learning for the assessments rather than assessments to address learning, which are the two major distinctions that the report does. So should we get rid of all these and then sort of focus on just the child and seeing how the child advances? So why have PISA in the first place? And then now what they're trying to do is they're trying to do a social and emotional assessment on the PISA, adding on to that. Get rid of it.
I mean, we talk about data here, so throwing out the data, I guess it makes you a bit worried. But I think as educators, I've been in personalized education and personalized learning for 20 years. There will always be a pressure on the academic side that you need certain skills. even to build society and build yourself as a human being.
Yeah.
But there will also be emotional and social parts of this. So I think my task as a director, the task for a teacher or a school leader, is to find that balance. Because if we see the whole student, it's of course to give them abilities that could be math, it could be science, could be reading, those type of abilities that we know are important, but finding the balance and give the bravery to teachers to be able to look at, as well as students' emotional and social side. So I think, I don't think we should throw it out, but I think we need to stand up and say we need to find this balance. A person is a whole person, and we need to respect that. Because if we talk about having a society based on, on peace and equality and sustainability, we must believe that the students that we meet, the children that we meet, if we don't make them flourish, there is no chance that it will happen.
You said the magic word, flourish. Thank you very much. There was this major report that was released in 20 years after Rio. Rio was 1992, so 2012, wasn't it? Yeah. Thank you. I will get back to you if you get this. So 2012, there was the report that was to look at the wealth of nations. And surprisingly, it was supported by the United Nations Environment Program because it had 3 capitals: human capital, produce capital, and natural capital. Guess what was the biggest capital for every nation state? Human capital. And it was primarily literacy, and it was bigger by a magnitude of 2, not just minor. The environment program was not happy because natural capital was second, but it makes sense, doesn't it? The human capital is the wealth of the nation, and I think the way we measure it is also doing injustice. And how do we broaden that? Now, I'm not sure what the time is. Have I just gone on ranting? Oh, there is time. So what does that 24 mean? Do I have 24 minutes left? Oh, great. So, are there any questions from the floor? Please introduce yourself and then.
There are people online that need to hear you. Use the microphone, please.
Hello there. My name's George Berwick, and I've been involved in education as a head teacher for 20 odd years, as well as running major national initiatives. And I sat here as normal. I would say to you, first of all, selecting what you were saying, which is one of the problems. I'm identifying the problems with your work. I find it very interesting, but as an old professional, I'm sitting here sifting through the information, deciding which bit I'm going to take and which bit I'm not. And that worries me because it strikes me that this is an holistic approach rather than a subset. You've presented a very coherent argument across a whole range of aspects of the work. The danger with my level of school improvement, colleagues tend to pick the little bits they want and miss all the joined up bits. How you ensure that as you move forward, I think, is your biggest challenge. I don't think it's necessarily engagement, because I think you'll find a whole range of engagements at different levels. Those who are interested in neuroscience will pick up the neuroscience bit, the people who are interested in data and so on. But the danger is that that's what becomes from this initiative rather than the coherent message you're putting across, which I think is very, very important. And it's been incredibly clearly presented today. Thank you.
Thank you. So basically, how do you ensure the multidisciplinary take is always, even in the implementation part? And I think, Jonathan, you brought up this whole issue in terms of research and developing the database. And one of the recommendations, if I'm not mistaken, is recommendation 11, where research funding is for global multidisciplinary research programs. So Zul, you have been involved in a lot of the global change programs, if I remember correctly from my previous engagements with IHDP and some of the others that were focusing on global change problems, and primarily it was climate change, primarily on biodiversity. but education was never considered as a global social good. Now, we make a very strong argument in this report that it's a global social good. And even UNESCO's report talks about a social contract for education. So in terms of the research agenda, how would you frame it from somebody who's worked in this field in terms of mobilizing a huge initiative on research? How would you frame that? If you were to advise the national science, the NSFs across the world.
Yep. Thank you. I think in our university, we use the word responsible research and innovation. And the word responsible means that any research that I want to do, I must consult the user from the beginning right to the end. They are part and parcel of the team that construct the research and if I finally evaluate the research. It is not like before when I do the research and then I plonk it to you, use it if it's applicable, otherwise it's okay. I can publish and I get good marks and that's okay. What you get is your problem. Now in our university we call responsible research means if I were to do a research with some community, that community must be involved. That community must be part and parcel of the research team. At the end of the day, they will want to decide whether we are successful or not. Doesn't matter which published journal, because they are going to benefit from our research.
So who is the community that you would identify in the education? The teachers, the students, or the policymakers in education? Or all three?
All three. Anybody who is involved, I think it is advertised. If you are involved, you are interested, come on board.
But that doesn't prevent from Gregoire just picking up all his friends in neuroscience and cognitive science and involving the teachers, the students, and then doing a research. He doesn't bring the economists. He doesn't bring the comparative education guys. He doesn't bring the philosophers. He just, his usual suspects, and then he produces. The transdisciplinary is so important. Should we make that as a necessary, just like the International Science Council, all right? Yeah. It was ISEE, which was all the natural sciences, then there was the social sciences, but in their wisdom, they have combined it because social problems have to be looked at transdisciplinary. Exactly. So how would you emphasize that even, let's say, as a very senior policymaker in the academic community in Malaysia, would you say, if I'm looking at a research proposal, if it doesn't have transdisciplinary, I just cut it off and throw it in the bin?
No. I think the beauty is that the moment a lot more people work, you find where the gaps are. Suddenly you need a philosopher, suddenly you need a geographer, suddenly you need... So all these things will come together before you even construct the research. You want to know who is responsible for what. And then the old way of doing it, we do the research team first and then they go. Here, the research team assemble what that needs to be done. And this is where sustainable development to me is important. It is about connecting the dots. Okay.
You have a very optimistic view of the academic community, which I don't have because these guys will create their own little silos. But Gregoire, you were itching to put your hand up, and then Jonathan.
Just going to try to convince you that I'm not going to take all my friends and do my research on my own. Because we actually are going to, I'm piloting this program in France where we get 20 million to do research on education, and 14 million will be about making sure we create research that is interdisciplinary, that is associating all the stakeholders. So the kids, the children, the students, of course, the policymakers, the teachers, and the parents. Let's not forget the parents. And around key issues that we all know are the big issues in education. Obviously, educational inequalities is the big issue. We all know that. That's the biggest problem we have in our educational system. Like I was mentioning the last time in Paris, that when you just enter the educational system, the inequalities are already there. Because if you are from a poor family, you only are exposed to 10 million words. When you're 36 months of age, 35 million if you're coming from a high SES family. And this is where you're going to build the educational inequalities. So what we need is research that associates everyone, basically, where we can show that actually we have the tools to reduce these inequalities. And then the tools, we know a bit what they are. It's like we seem to imply that there's two types of abilities: the cognitive one, the the reading one, the math one, and then there is the social emotional one. No, but those are also abilities that we need to teach very explicitly, and we need to teach how to learn before engaging the students in the cultural tools acquisition. We do everything backward. So we start actually by starting to teach those cultural tools that are super complex to acquire for our brain, such as reading, but without giving the tools to do it. So what we need is research that shows that this is actually effective, but not just by the cognitive scientists, but like if I go with a philosopher, if I go with, and in order to do that, what I think is not to say, let's organize yourself, guys, is we need to have like something where we go by step. First, you do like a call, and then you work with the team, and you make sure that they assemble each of the piece before you start the research.
So it has to be built into that research call, isn't it? Because if you remember even with this assessment, all right, and you saw it as a working group co-chair on how silos were, people brought their own, the usual suspects because they were comfortable working with them. But to make it as a necessary condition, so if you look at policy recommendations, 10 and in fact 9, 10 and 11, parents, teachers, communities, which is and then the final is the research community.
Yeah.
And it has to be transdisciplinary. And you left out economists. You looked at me and then you just left out the economists.
No, I'm working with economists. Now I know how you work, guys. You designed the RCTs and then you go to the psychologist and say, could you tell me what I should put in the RCTs? But I think that's the key. The research like core should be about interdisciplinary. And you should say, well, look, it's not because you are not at the point where you have all the elements of the team, but let's work with you to make sure you have all the elements so we know that we're going to be effective in the research.
So let me go to Amara, who's a policy maker and who most probably holds the strings to the purse, and sort of saying, Amara, in South Africa, is there a very close relationship with the policy maker, with the research and academic community, or it's really not there yet?
I think in South Africa, and this is a generalization for the country because it is quite a big country, but I think if I look at my own region, we do have explicit links with universities within our regions. I think there can be better collaboration and planning. But if I take an example of, it's not an RCT that we're currently running, but it's a quasi-experimental method, where we are partnering with an organization, JPAL, and they do and run RCTs across the globe. And we basically work with them very closely in a violence prevention project. So we've started working with them right from the beginning. So in terms of project conceptualization, we are now moving into a pilot phase, and then over the next year or two, we'll then go into a scaled up method. So I think in some parts of government this does work, but in many parts it doesn't. And I think it is this point about what we need as policymakers are not always produced at the academic level. And similarly, maybe academics don't fully understand what we need from them. So I don't think it's a blaming game for us or them, but I think that more concerted effort could be taken to be able to really understand each other. And I think that's something that we just don't always do. So we get frustrated because things take long. You need long sets of time frames to be able to produce one result, whereas for us, policy is quick. It needs to be done quite efficiently. It needs to be cost effective. And so we cannot wait 5 or 6 or 10 years to be able to get the result. In most instances, we need something to be done in a 1-year time frame, 2-year time frame, 3-year time frame. And I think it's about reconciling those differences to be able to really get the results that we actually need. And so I think it's a long way still to go, but there are certainly conversations happening at the moment.
Interesting. So 3 years, 2 years, but if you make 2 years of inconsistent, another 2 years of inconsistent, that's 10 years of inconsistent. And if you had a consistent, you would have got it in 6 years. But unfortunately, the reality of the policy-making cycles. What came to me from this discussion, which we had never thought earlier on, as part of the global change environment in the past, maybe it is time for the NSFs and the research faculties around the world to set up at a global level a research program on education as a global good, and to sort of then fund systematic, organized, structured research across the world so that we don't get into the weird database, but a much more diverse database, and something that establishes this and monitors this. So it could be the International Science Council, because they kind of work with the research foundations. UNESCO, this is recorded, so UNESCO could be a potential, maybe a catalyst, but maybe it's a science body that takes care of this. I know Future Earth might be something that could be looking at this, because they only look at climate change and the environmental issues, but education seems to be such a essential component. Jonathan.
Obviously very supportive of that kind of idea. And recommendation 6 calls for the formation of this global database, and this is something that is achievable. So in working group 4, underpinning those findings that I talked about earlier is a database of 2,600 studies where we've extracted the data about where they've happened, about what methodologies have been used, about their overall impact. And the important thing about pulling that evidence together is it helps us overcome many of the challenges that we've talked about today. So it helps us overcome the challenge of speed, because if you have the data readily available from high quality studies, you can do things like rapid reviews, where you say, what is the question I want to answer? Let's get that data really quickly without sending research assistants off for 2 years to do the data extraction. It helps with context, because actually at the moment what tends to happen is you have repositories and databases of studies that sit in the global north or the global south and don't speak to each other. And it's only when you see when things have been more or less impactful in different settings that you can begin to explore context. You can't do it by just looking at studies in one place or another. You need to pull it together and look systematically. And it also helps overcome with this challenge about being I'm going to really struggle, cross-disciplinary, because often we see quantitative and qualitative research as oppositional, and maybe that's a cultural thing, maybe that comes from competing in funding rounds, but high-quality research has both. Because if you just get an impact out without understanding why things are working, it's going to be very difficult to implement it in a different context to understand why it works. And if we're not building upon theoretical evidence and evidence about ways that the brain work, we're less likely to have the good studies and the studies that have positive results. And so that recommendation 6 and this movement towards a much more coherent system and infrastructure of evidence underpinning everything is really important, because what we know about education should be a global good. It shouldn't sit in the heads of experts. It shouldn't sit in one system or another. It should exist for the benefit of everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Tacit knowledge is very important. We talk about expert as though they know everything, but I think the tacit knowledge is the one that I'm worried about. Language is going to die. I think the prediction is we're going to go from 7,000 languages to only 700 languages. In other words, the kind of knowledge we're going to have will be reductionist. And these are the issues, I think.
But this study counters that, and it really emphasizes, in fact, mother tongue for the first 5 grades, actually.
Right.
And so in many ways it counters like some of the policies in India where they were, some states have said English, which goes counters to what the science is saying. Mother tongue is so important. And in fact, you improve language acquisition of second languages much faster when you have mother tongue.
Exactly.
So these kind of, and is based on science and is based on evidence. And I think that counters policymakers who think English is the way to compete in this modern world. I think I would prefer Klingon, but the UN never created a universal language. Maybe it's never too late. But I wanted to thank we are coming close because I just remembered we have some videos of from the children who are basically our clients at the end of the day. This is the one sector that does not listen to the client, which makes very bad economics decision making. We must always listen to the client. And the client is the child, not the education, not the teacher, but the child. Thank you for your wisdoms, your words of wisdoms, patience, and really, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I want to have some comments from the children from across the world in terms of. Thank you, Amira. It's always we forget the person who is online. Thanks a lot, and. I'm sure it must be a great day in Cape Town.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me.
Not at all. Okay. So we go on to the videos with some of the wisdoms from our clients. Please.
An education that is guided by values such as integrity, honesty, teamwork, and respect helps to solve most of the problems in the world, such as violence, pollution, inequality, corruption.
I feel our education systems treat assessments as if they are the end, as if the reason we as students have been educated is to take and pass tests. Seeing assessments as the end goal undermines the process of education, for by cramming days, weeks, months, and even years of education into single assessments, we neglect what has truly been learnt and developed, and focus instead on the product, the percentage or symbol at the top of the page.
There are certainly methods of teaching that are more successful in helping students learn without them building resentment towards education as a whole. Students are able to recognize when teachers don't value them as individuals, which can often discourage them from putting in effort into work. So having teachers who, even in the slightest, make the effort to get to know their students can be the difference between pupils doing the bare minimum to complete their assignments and them exploring and showing genuine interest in their coursework.
Assessments are by no means useless. When approached correctly, they provide invaluable and personalized feedback on a student's progress and understanding for any particular area of study. However, in order to make use of such a valuable asset, students, teachers, and education systems at large have to radically change their mindsets towards education and begin treating towards education and assessments and begin treating them as what they are, tools, a means to an end to improve education rather than the purpose of education itself.
Today, if a person decides to choose a path different than the one the society has told, he will be demotivated, taunted, and teased, only to end up with him taking his own life. Society cannot change the environment unless we speak up and act against this. For us to reform and build a new society, we need to constantly build a better education system where choices and options are welcome, and which frames the society by the path of utilitarianism.
So we hear what our clients are saying. We are not doing it, which means we should be all sacked as CEOs, shouldn't we, if we use that basis. I like the young gentleman on assessment, said it very clearly. Okay, thank you very much. I want to invite, last but not least, one of my favorite people on this planet, Her Excellency Rosa Otunbayeva, who's a former president of the Kyrgyz Republic, a young soul at heart, And she is an advisory board member of the ISEE, but she is also an advisory on our governing board of the Institute for the last 8 years. She's the one who has kept me from misbehaving for the last 8 years and keep me in check every year. And so, Rosa, please.
It was such an enjoyable talk today, conversation. I do realize that the value of this institute, Gandhi Institute, is really very high. There are probably 2 dozens of institutes under UNESCO, right? But if every institute will produce such a report, global reports, and with such a depth and understanding of the subject, then I think every contribution to this international organization will be quite valuable and efficient. Otherwise, we do understand that there are so many meetings in UNESCO, and ministers of education come to these sessions, and I hope that this report will be introduced to all of them, and certainly this report should be introduced in every country in details. And I invite someone from this distinguished circle really to come and to present such a valuable report. You know, we just started to learn this words, social, emotional learning. This is new for a general education system. In our American, in Bishkek, in my capital city, we have American University of Central Asia. They have this in pedagogy faculty or departments. They teach students, but this is unfortunately, seems to me, didn't reach general school circles. This COVID was really very bad, and you, I guess, Anant, now compare this with the Third World War, what if, or I was not attentive. Anyway, that was a really bad thing. But nevertheless, the COVID pushed all of us into this digital world. So whoever in the most remote villages in my country, for example, they started to get this the most simple such apparatus to learn. For example, I have in my foundation such a project how to attach elderly to learn about the digital financing. So I have seen in Malaysia, in Singapore, that this is general for everyone you are learning. So little and old, all of them, they are now learning more and more. I think the whole society should learn about all of this. And then, of course, all of us, we became more sensitive and more open to education. But what I want to underline in this conversation, I'm in this my shoes because I was running around and I have seen about 20 probably pavilions. And there, of course, this is such an expo which is feast of efforts, education for the world, and everyone demonstrates the best of their country. But I must tell you that education is not so much accentuated in many pavilions. they are very, they want to make effects on the, with the sounds, with the splashes and everything. How do you find some knowledge, facts? And that means to me that education is like it's like felicitation. It's not so much like like your work, hard work, and. In all our countries, in the, I would say, in the global south, budget for education, it's not very high, although I must tell you, we have good budget, but to organize all of them, and in your reports, teaching teachers, this is the most important. First of all, teachers community should be educated, and I underscore almost each such a very important points in your report, and I want to tell you that each working group, and you are leading experts in these working groups, you have produced very important such a product. 5 kilo, you said, Nanindi, right? It's just quite a big products over there. I wish that it will reach everyone, every country, every country. It will be known to our ministers. Unfortunately, they are rotating very quickly, all these ministers. Nevertheless, in such an educational community should be known, I hope. And again, Anant, I applaud to the work of Institute, which has gathered 300 experts from 45 countries, as it is known, for such a, to make such a report. I want to thank you, Swedish government and Swedish Pavilion here, that you made possible, you give us such a venue where such a thriving talk today was set up. And I thank you, everyone who came from all of the corner of the world to present and promote this report. Because writing, it is 2.5 years, it was big deal. Now we must promote this and make sure that it will reach everyone, every country, every educational such a community, and we would learn more and more about this facts and new sites of education. You are talking about data. Look, we don't have any data. PISA, yes, we are there. But we just want to be alongside with all other countries to make sure that we are in PISA. You are talking today that we should sort of rid of PISA. So, I mean, there is of course, this is the changing world, but I congratulate all of you with this report, and I hope that each of us must bring own contribution to promote this report. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. Well, let me conclude by saying what's next, as everybody was looking at what's next. Two levels. First, I want to say that this report was officially launched in Paris on the 22nd. And from our initial statistics, it seems that it's reached about 2 billion viewers. So it's quite a bit. It's gone quite viral. And I'm getting all kinds of emails from people who I thought would never be following something of this nature, but they're responding. So I think we'll continue with that. It's not a one-off, Rosa. It's going to continue for the full year. We will be having regional presentations across the 5 or 6 regions of UNESCO. We have already been requested by the Africa group in Paris to provide a more detailed presentation to the Africa group, and I'm sure the others would do the same. On 2 levels, the research, I think we have heard enough of in terms of a global multidisciplinary change program, and I think the Institute will work very closely with ISEE and others. We have already been requested by ISEE to come and make a presentation in Paris. The second one is institutionalizing such a process, and I think it's important that this becomes institutionalized within UNESCO, and I've already stressed that in Paris, that it has to be part of UNESCO's DNA, as science and evidence has to be part of the UNESCO's education sector. And of course, my dream would be to have something called ISPE, the Intergovernmental Science and the Science Panel on Education. People criticize me going around developing these intergovernmental platforms. The last one was IPBES. I hope that before I pass this from this world, I would get to see ISPE, the Intergovernmental Science Panel on Education. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day at this expo. Thank you.